is a provocation zone discussion, and just to make sure you all are in the right place, we're going to be discussing late abortion and asking how late is too late. My name is Bríd Hehir, and I work as a charity fundraiser now, but I used to work as a nurse and midwife, so this is a discussion close to my heart for quite a long time. I'm assuming that everybody in the room is pro-choice, because this isn't a discussion between pro-life and pro-choice. We're very lucky that we're going to have a really good discussion, hopefully, between people who are pro-choice, but about time limits. So we've got two very knowledgeable, very experienced, articulate speakers who are going to give us their view on the discussion before we open it up to the floor. Both will speak for about 10 minutes, and then we'll involve you in the discussion. I'll introduce the speakers in the order that they're going to speak. And first, our guest from the United States is William Saletan, from Will. And he's joined us from New York City, from Washington, sorry, where he's the national correspondent for the online magazine Slate. And he writes the Human Nature column covering science, technology, and politics. He's written for a wide variety of magazines, and he's written for the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, the New Republic, and Mother Jones. He's got a longer biography on the website if you want to find out more about him or talk to him afterwards. And he's the author of a very important book called Bearing Right, How Conservatives Won the Abortion War. On my right is Furedi, who's been the Chief Executive Officer of British Pregnancy Advisory Service since 2003. Before that, she was Director of Policy and Press for the Human Fertilisation and Embryology Authority. That's the UK's regulator of embryo research and assisted conception. BPAS specialises in late abortion and provides almost 70% of those that take place in Britain. She's written extensively in defence of women's autonomy of reproductive choice, and she currently chairs the Voice of Choice Coalition of UK's pro-choice organisations. Both BPAS and the Royal College of Arts Student Union are debate partners for this session, and we're grateful for their support. I'm going to do something that doesn't happen often in these discussions. I'm going to take a vote and ask your opinion on where you stand on this issue before we start. So, should abortion be time limited? The law says it's 24 weeks maximum. What I'm asking you now, though, is, are you in favour of time limits? Are you in favour of time limits? Or should abortion be available as late as necessary? So those in favour of abortion available as late as necessary, do you want to put your hands up? Okay, who's in favour of time limits? Okay, and who's undecided? Hands up. Make up your mind. Okay. All right. At the moment, it's kind of half and half. There you go. So, Will, the floor is yours.
Okay. So the question that was posed to us is, how late is too late? And I'm going to violate the rules by not answering that question. I think there are too many people who tend to have definitive answers, and what I would rather do is bring some facts to bear, put some things on the table, and in the hope that we can have a conversation and that each of you can think about how late might be too late from your point of view. I had a handout, and I hope everybody has a copy of that. If you don't, let me know, and if you want. But it has a lot of numbers on it, and I don't want to be reciting a bunch of numbers, so hopefully if you have it in your hands, I can just direct you through it. The first page, page 1 of that handout, has polling data on it. And I don't propose that polls should resolve any issue for you. But I've put these numbers here in the hope of making you think a little bit, particularly if you come from a perspective of believing in women's rights or personal freedom. If you look at polling data in the United States and the United Kingdom over the last 30 years, or 40 years in some of these cases, you see massive shifts in public opinion on questions of the role of women and questions of personal autonomy. So in the UK, you can see in the British Social Attitude Survey, shifts of 24 to 30 points on questions of women staying home when they have kids, whether the wife's job is to look after the home and family. You see shifts on sexuality, on the rights of lesbian couples. You see shifts on the question of whether certain things are wrong or not. You see huge shifts in same-sex sex, premarital sex. Extramarital sex, that was stupid of me to put in the not wrong at all figure. I did that for to keep all the numbers parallel because one can't fall. But I assure you that if you look at the same question in terms of people who, the percentage who said always or mostly, there was in fact a net shift in the conservative direction on extramarital sex over those 30 years. When we get to abortion, we don't see that shift. Okay, we see in fact a shift in the opposite direction on the questions where the social attitude survey asked about whether abortion is wrong. So we're seeing people moving on questions of personal autonomy, people moving on questions of women's rights and women's role, not moving on abortion. Why? And I will point out one other thing that I did not put on this from the same British Attitude Survey. If you look at polling on capital punishment from 1986 to 2009, the percentage of people who said that for some crimes the death penalty is the most appropriate sentence, that went from, the percentage of people who agreed with that went from 74 to 55, so nearly a 20-point drop over this period. So perhaps there is some question of whether some people are seeing this in terms of life, not merely in terms of choice. If you look at data in the US, you'll see the same patterns on homosexuality, premarital sex, no shift again on extramarital sex. So some morals are moving and some are staying the same. And I'm not going to recite all the other data, you can just glance at the ones from the US, but you'll see the same pattern. The one I do want to point you to is that third one. Is it all right for a wife to refuse to have children if a husband wants to have children? Okay. That is a straightforward question of the woman's rights vis-a-vis the man and vis-a-vis childbearing, the right not to bear children. And there has been, as you see, a significant shift in the pro-choice direction on that question, but not on abortion. As you see, the abortion numbers have gone the other direction. So again, polls don't settle this, but they should make us think, and I think my proposal is that they should make us realize that there is more to this issue than feminism or personal autonomy, that abortion is not just an issue of personal rights, it is an issue of one person growing inside another. And I am not saying that personhood begins at conception. I do not believe that. Okay, that's not the way life is. What I am saying is that personhood grows and that it does so during gestation. If you look over at the second page, it says developments by week of gestation. I put this, you can see the sources for this at the bottom. There are no right-to-life organizations in here. This is out of the Royal College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists and several other sources that I trust. So it's a composite timeline. But what I want you to notice is how early the development of these capacities begins and how continuous it is. We talk about viability, we talk about what happens at 20 or 22 or 24 weeks, but what you'll notice is you're starting to see as early as week 3 differentiation of tissues. You're starting to see the beginnings of the nervous system as early as week 6. You're starting to see networking within the brain like around week 9 or 12. You're starting to see movements in weeks 13 to 14. You're starting to see rudimentary perception at week 16. And you're starting to see at week 18 what they call brain-generated stress response to tissue damage. Now this is not pain. There's been a lot of debate about fetal pain, and there are lots of legislation in the state that are going around the United States to ban abortions at 20 weeks or so, based on, sometimes earlier, based on fetal pain. Pain is a very complicated question. We just don't have evidence of fetal pain. There is, in fact, a debate. The Royal College says you can't have pain until you have a completely wired system. So I think the pain debate is a distraction, but what I want you to see is the development of the nervous system, okay, irrespective of that. If you go beyond, so that's all of what I just described. Oh, and we go up to week 22, week 23, you're starting to see there pattern recognition in fetal behavior. You're seeing habituation, responses to impulses. The fetus is, in some sense, I'm not sure I would say it's cognitive, but it is recognizing certain patterns of stimuli and responding accordingly. That is all happening. All of that is happening before the legal 24-week limit. So there's a lot of development that has happened there. So what I want you to gather see at this is that I'm in right now. The growth of the rational capacities that signify personhood is a gradual process, okay, and it is underway long before the legal limit of abortion rights. Anne has written in some of our exchange online, I think she asked, is there anything, her quote is there anything qualitatively different about a fetus at, say, 28 weeks that gives it a morally different status to a fetus at 18 weeks or even 8 weeks? This timeline is my answer to that question. If you go beyond the 24-week limit, you start to see, as you see lung capacity, you're starting to see essentially viability, development of lungs, and from weeks 24 to 28, a huge progress in brain construction. There's one at 24 to 28, there's another one about 33 to 37 weeks. So if we were talking about a 28-week fetus, you're talking about, at 28 weeks, you can see here on the timeline, it says spontaneous brain activity of cortical origin. That, I believe, is scientific for thinking. That is thinking that you're saying there. So viability and cognitive development, which I think should concern us. Let me skip to the reasons why women are having these abortions. I put on page 4 of the printout some polling from the U.S. The reasons that are given here, the number one reason that was given in the U.S. for having a second trimester abortion was that it took a long time to make arrangements. I think that has to do with the American healthcare system more than anything else. But if you look at the difference between second trimester and first trimester abortions, the biggest difference is women who say it took a long time to decide. That is the biggest differentiator. And I think I would hope we'll talk today about the reasons why women take long to decide, why those women do. I don't think this is a huge number of women, but we should talk about the reasons for it. If you look at data in the UK, it's a little bit different. A study in England and Wales from 2005, the number one reason given by women who had second trimester abortions as to why it took as long as it did was, quote, I was not sure about having the abortion, and it took me a while to make my mind up and ask for one. If I have just a couple of minutes, do I? One more, okay. Because Anne, in what I think is a commendable act of candor, published a BPAS, a list of 32 women, I think it was, who come in during a 4-week period in 2008. And she just published what their stated reasons were for what their circumstances were and what their stated reasons were for seeking the abortion. And if you look through these women who are at the bottom of that page 4, these clients, 3 of them are talking about, I had to push it out of my mind, I found the decision hard to make. This is not the only reason. There are lots of other women in totally wrenching circumstances, and I hope Anne will bring those up. But these 5 cases to me are problematic. And if you look at the 3rd and the 5th one, client 18, she says, at first I decided to continue the pregnancy. And then she says she sort of changed her mind based on some circumstances. She thought she couldn't cope with the child. I hope we will talk today about separating the 2 acts, separating the choice to have an abortion from the choice as to when you have the abortion. Once you know you are pregnant, my argument is delay is either a choice or it's something for which you bear some responsibility. And even if you have freedom of choice, you don't have the right to wait and wait and wait to make that decision. You have a moral obligation to make it as as expeditiously as you responsibly can. And the last woman, I just wanted to say, she says, client 25, was not aware that there was a legal time limit on abortion, so didn't feel the need to act. Have we developed a mindset that whatever is legal is moral, that without a legal time limit, there's no need to act quickly? And should we talk today, perhaps, about whether within what is legal, we should try to discuss what is moral and perhaps influence women's choices or encourage women's choices to be more moral? Thank you.
Excellent. Anne?
Well, thanks for making what I think are some rich and interesting remarks in relation to this debate. And I think it is incredibly good to take it beyond the usual head-to-head principled opposition to abortion as opposed to a principled pro-choice position. But I would say that the reason why we're having the debate, I think, is because there's been quite a strong argument put, and I think you put it well, and certainly some of the people that you've worked with in the US have put it, that continued support for later abortions is a problem because it is undermining support for early abortions as well, and that it's become a burden and a barrier to the pro-choice movement, and perhaps we should give it up a little bit. And I think that you give an indication of that in your final remarks, where you're kind of making the point that, well, abortion's okay, just about, but if women are going to do it, they've got a responsibility to make sure that they do it earlier, because it's generally a bad thing, and so we like to see less of it, and we certainly like to see it earlier rather than later. And I think it does raise some important issues for us, because I think that where you're absolutely right is that public opinion on late abortion is very shaky. It is something that I think all of us that are involved in abortion care and abortion advocacy find quite difficult, because people look at the pictures of the developed fetus and they perceive it as being something that is fundamentally different to the idea of a very early embryo. And it is different in some ways. It looks different. It looks like a baby. It's clearly much closer to that. And it provokes a much more visceral response in people than perhaps early abortion, which they can see as being more like inducing a period event. And I think that there is also a sense that people understand, certainly there's a strong understanding in British public opinion, that contraception fails, and we value Planned Parenthood very strongly. And so, therefore, women do need some access to abortion, but that can be done early on, and there's no excuse for women who are really, as you indicated, delaying because they're having difficulty making up their minds. So I think that we can perceive that there's a problem. I think what we have to ask ourselves is whether or not there needs to be any policy intervention or any social intervention to change or to regulate what's really going on at the moment. And I don't think that we do. I think that there is no evidence to suggest that we need to restrict later abortions in any way by legal time limits. I certainly don't see any reason why that for us to think that doctors are abusing the situation, or indeed that women are abusing the situation, whatever abuse of that might be. It's interesting that I think that on a sentimental, on an emotional level, women's attitude to their pregnancy changes as the pregnancy progresses. There are many women who will say that they would have an early abortion, but they wouldn't have a late abortion. The number of women who request late abortions is very small. The number of abortions that doctors do is very small. So consequently, there's no sense, I believe, that people have a coarsened view or an irrelevant view to a developing sense of life in the womb. There's no need for us to be particularly intervening in that. And I think that we have to look, therefore, at whether or not there's a moral or a social reason why we should be looking to restrict the number of late abortions, whether or not there's some impact other than that on the individual women that means that we should make changes. And I think that's really where you and I do profoundly disagree. I'm very pleased that you put out this handout that identifies the development by week of gestation, because to you what it does is to indicate that there are firm points at which things morally and practically change in the abortion debate. For me what it does is to in some ways illustrate my argument that there isn't any profound points at which you can say that there is a difference between one and another. I would accept that abortion stops a beating heart, and I would accept that abortion ends a potential human life, even in the very earliest weeks of pregnancy. And so if we think that that is a morally wrong or a morally coarsening thing to do, then I think that we need to oppose abortion right from the very earliest weeks. And if we don't, then I think that we have to really ask ourselves very clearly who decides when late is too late, and who has the capacity to make that decision, and who has the right to intervene in that, because it's a very shaded thing and it's determined very much by people's circumstances. And I think that that is a decision that must be taken by the people who are most involved in it, not policymakers and not journalists, and not even people like me actually, who run services. Because what I would say is that, women make decisions about abortion in the context of their lives. And there are some women who would feel that 11 weeks is too late for them, or that 10 weeks is too late for them, because of their personal circumstances. There are other women who, faced with a decision quite late on in pregnancy, will feel that they can no longer bear to carry that child to term. And I would really question why, if there is no objective reason, no objective sudden value change, we need to intervene and make the point that we have the right to override her own subjective decision about that, because I basically think that any definition of what late abortion is arbitrary and it is subjective. The only thing that I'm actually prepared to say where there is a difference is possibly the point of viability at 24 weeks, because I think that then we can say that there is something that in public opinion there is a kind of visceral step over the line. But my only reason for suggesting that is to do with public policy and what would be publicly acceptable, not that I personally think that there is a particular difference. Does late abortion have a detrimental effect on society? No, I really don't think it does. I think that there is no sense that the number of women requesting late abortions is increasing. It remains very much the same. Does the idea that we can override who should decide these decisions have a detrimental effect on society? Yes, I really believe that does. Because I think what we're saying when we say that somehow an earlier time limit needs to be imposed is that we don't trust women's decisions. We don't trust doctors' decisions. And, it's interesting how individually we look at these things, because I really felt when I looked at the reasons why those 32 women who came to us were requesting late abortion was that each of them had a compelling reason in their own way. And that the idea of compelling those women to continue a pregnancy was somehow really beyond the pale. Because I think we have to remember that that's the alternative. That when we turn around and say to a woman who's requesting abortion at 20 weeks that she should have requested it earlier, we're still basically saying that a decision has to be made as to whether or not we deny it. So what I think that we should do is trust women to make their decisions, because they will look at themselves in the mirror every day for the rest of their lives knowing the decision that they've made. We should trust doctors to make the decision about what they think is safe and acceptable for them. And as far as possible, we should keep policymakers away from it, and we should try and inform public opinion rather than be swayed by what I think is often ill-informed public opinion.
Okay, we thank our two speakers. Before I involve the audience, Will and Anna, I just want to ask you both some questions about what each of you have said in response to each other. And the thing that struck me about what you said quite strongly was this thing about the potential of the fetus, that, you know, that personhood grows. So, but we have potential from the moment we're conceived until we're born. And so when do you grant it, when does the status change to say it has potential here and right, and from now on we value it as a person?
Well, I think that the potential argument is an argument made a lot by pro-life people who believe in life at conception, because you have the potential, as you say, you have the potential right away at fertilization. So to me, the potential argument does not. What I'm trying to make is an actual argument. I mean, I'm trying to argue about actual capacities at these phases, because since potential is, as you say, it's an unfolding from the very beginning. The whole program is there, and that's the argument that Robbie George and a lot of conservatives have made. To me, that doesn't capture the essence of the fact that although the fetus has the embryo has potential from the beginning, the actual status is changing, and that's what I'm supposed to focus on.
Okay. And Anne is very much coming out in favor of women's rights. Yeah?
Yes.
Completely, totally. So what's your problem, essentially, with that?
Oh, I don't have a problem with women's rights, and I don't think, to refer back to that polling data, I don't think a lot of those people who have changed their opinions about women's rights. I mean, I think there's an embrace of women's rights. What I want to argue against here is this is totally an issue of women's rights. It is absolutely an issue of women's rights. It's just not only an issue of women's rights. Okay, it is. I mean, pregnancy. I mean, if you're a woman, this is something you think about as your body. If you're a man, it's like, guys, this is one person literally growing inside another person. That's why this is such a complicated issue. And it's not that way at the beginning. It's that way at the end. And so there's this gradual process going on in which what starts out as a question of completely of women's, the right to contraception, to me is a no-brainer. That's a question of personal autonomy. And then now you've conceived. Well, so now we're in the question, you can take a morning after pill. You're dealing with a very tiny embryo at a stage when embryos are flushed all the time. It's not, to me, that's not a clear line. But then, as we go longer and longer into the process, you have more and more time for the choice to be exercised. And on the other side, you have a greater and greater actual rational capacity on the part of the fetus. And so the balance begins to shift. And the question, to me, is at what point have we moved from a women's rights framework too far in the direction of a life framework?
Good. So, Anne, Will is saying very much that it's one person inside another, and at some stage, a woman who is pregnant has to make a choice that takes into account that this is a potential person, not a problem just to be gotten rid of.
Yeah, and I feel like I'm in a kind of slightly weird situation here, because I feel as though I'm going to come over in a minute as being the pro-life person on the panel here, because I would concede that yes, there is potentially a person growing inside another person. I wouldn't even draw the distinction about the actuality of some of these points that you made about weeks of gestation. I just don't really see the relevance in pointing them. So for me, it doesn't really matter that at 3 weeks the brain and the spinal cord and the heart are beginning to develop. and then by 26 weeks you've got auditory cortex beginning to respond to sound. I don't really see why those two things matter differently morally. I can see that there's a physical difference, but I don't really see why we need to accord a different moral standing to it. What I see as being continuous is that to deny a woman an abortion, to deny a woman the ability to end the pregnancy, either early in the pregnancy or later in the pregnancy, means essentially exactly the same thing, which is that it's denying her the ability to have a final say over what is going on in her body and to her life, in a way that we don't even insist on when you're talking about the responsibilities between mothers and their born children. And so to use an example on this very, very briefly, what you're saying is that in pregnancy, a woman has a responsibility to her fetus at 26 weeks that I perhaps wouldn't have to my child at 28 months. And what I mean by that, or even 18 years or 16 years, and what I mean by that is that if my child required a kidney from me or a bone marrow transplant from me to save its life, I could not be compelled to make that sacrifice by law or by policy. You might think it would be morally reprehensible for me to refuse to do that. Indeed, I would think it would be morally reprehensible for me to refuse to do that. But you could not compel me to do that in law or in policy. And yet what we're saying is with abortion that a woman should be compelled to take away her ability to determine what goes on with her own body for the benefit of a potential life, or a life that does not even know that it's alive. And I find that deeply troubling, because I think that once we basically say that women's ability to exercise their bodily autonomy in pregnancy is overruled and undermined, it sets up a precedent for what we say about people's autonomy right the way across the board. And I'm really uncomfortable with that distinction. And that, I think, is a fundamental difference between us.
Would you like to respond?
Well, I have several things that I'd love to respond to, if that's okay.
All right, yes, go ahead.
I'll try to do it concisely, and then just put these on the table, and then people we can talk about them. To Anne's point about that there's sort of an arbitrary or subjective aspect to these thresholds along the way of development. That there's no clear point when we can draw a line, and therefore, if you're going to be against it, you should be against it from the very beginning. That is, by the way, the argument of the pro-lifers that you have. So, to my mind, I find myself in a very curious position, as Anne says, of feeling. When I've had these exchanges with Anne, I do feel as though I'm having the same argument I have with the pro-lifers, that things are, that life is not like that. It's not clear.
Just a
things
fundamentalist.
So, and sometimes, actually, politically, I'm afraid when I hear Anne talk, I think, don't say that. So first of all, I don't agree with it, but secondly, that you're totally lending credibility to the argument of the other side. But I trust Anne to handle her own in that debate with them. But the other thing I wanted to say about that is this timeline that I gave you. I mean, I ran out of space on the page, and I said, I'm going to stop it right here. It doesn't end at birth. It doesn't end at birth. Okay, if you look at that Lagerkrantz article, that's an argument about the emergence of consciousness. And they go on and they talk about the development of cognitive capacities after birth. Okay, it isn't until you are 3 years old that you have full capacity for memory. People don't remember what went on before. The brain is changing, capacities are changing. Why isn't birth just another arbitrary line? Right? We really need to talk about whether any lines can be drawn. And if we can draw a line at birth or at viability, then we are already in the business of deciding, based on this information, that there is such a thing as an allowable legal time limit. I think I wanted to say one other thing, and that was, Anne Anne's point about who decides, this is the pro-choice mantra, and I agree in general with the principle of who decides. But two things. One, remember, this is not a debate between two people who disagree about whether women should have the right to choose. This is a debate about the when. Okay, and I understand that it's still an abortion restriction, but it is saying you can be pro-choice and leave open the question of whether that should be left up. And secondly, this is not the who decides argument is that things are too subjective for the law to intervene. That timeline is not subjective. Okay, it doesn't vary enormously from pregnancy to pregnancy. That is objective information. And the law is entitled to examine objective fact and drawing lines. And as to trusting women to make decisions, look, I'm all for trusting women. But women are not angels any more than men are, okay? Some women, like some men, will make bad decisions, all right? And the law, it's not as though we should say, well, we're gonna have, and I don't want to equate abortion with murder, okay? But we have laws against murder and lots of other things, even if murder is rarely practiced. We don't say, we're going to trust that we have a relatively peaceful society, and so we're not going to have laws against it. We have laws for the people at the extremes. And so to me it's patronizing women to say we should trust so far that even in the most patently, the cases, do you guys follow the Gosnell case in the United States, the Philadelphia doctor? Okay, it's illegal abortions, right? So let's stipulate that. But there's a case in there where a woman has an abortion at 29 weeks. She comes in for the abortion. Then, in the middle of the process, she finds out that the doctor is going to burn the fetal remains, and she changes her mind.
Oh, God.
Okay? That's at 29 weeks. All right, after all the brain construction of the 24th to 28th weeks. So, there are just people, whether they're men or women, who are, you're out in an area that's crazy. And some doctors do that. And for those extremes, I propose that the law should draw a line.
Right. There's a lot of moving at the table, and I can hear from the audience that there's a lot of reactions to it. So I'll just take a few more questions and then ask our panelists to come back. Right, there's a guy here, second row.
I mean, there seems to be agreement on the panel about the potential of life for fetus. Do you seem kind of, I haven't got your hand out, so maybe I'm missing it. You seem unwilling, maybe you're not a scientist or whatever, to say when you think actual life is, which would be useful for us, because you both agree there's a potential for life for fetus, but you seem to the distinction between actual life, and you don't seem to have said so far when that is actually, which would then obviously frame legislation and policy.
All right,
It's probably indeed following on from the chat just back there. You did describe this continuum of evolving personhood throughout fetal stages, and you pointed out quite rightly this actually continues after birth. So just for the sake of exactitude and precision, what do you think constitutes personhood, rationally, scientifically? What is a human person? A human being begins at the body conception and continues thereon. What makes a human being become a human person is a human being with rights. And also, in that case, when do you think the line should be drawn? Or is it for you a purely open question? I'd also like to hear Fredi's point of view on both those questions, actually.
Okay, and there's the woman just behind her.
Thank you. I wanted to make two comments really. The first is about the Gosling case in Pennsylvania, and it's a very simple point, just to say that there are bad doctors in every field of medicine, and I think to even begin to discuss that case as some sort of example of what's good or bad in abortion services and women's decisions, good or bad, and doctors' decisions, good or bad, about abortion is actually very spurious. But more importantly, I wanted to talk about the facts of fetal development and how women think about them, because I just finished a study actually where we talked to women about how they thought their fetuses should be disposed of following abortion, and whether or not they felt that the fetus should be accorded some sort of different status and be managed differently from other forms of clinical waste, like, for example, an appendix. So should there be funeral rites, cremation, is it okay to get rid of this clinical waste, so on and so forth. And I would say that for individual women, and these were all women who chose to have an abortion, and some of whom had had miscarriages, and many of whom had had babies, there was a recognition that there were milestones that mattered to them when things might change. But there was considerable instability around those milestones, some of which had to do with their own personal knowledge about when things developed. Nevertheless, for some women, they did draw a line. However, that did not mean that they couldn't distinguish between their own ability to cherish and want one pregnancy and not want or reject another pregnancy. And it was because it wasn't the facts of fetal development that mattered in terms of making a decision about abortion at a particular gestational age, but the facts of having a child and how they were going to manage that in their current social, family, economic context that really mattered in the next sort of 18 plus years. That's what really mattered, and that's what helped them make the decision. And I think that your assertion that we should be helping women be more moral in their decisions about having abortions earlier and not recognizing that actually taking time to consider whether the fact of that child should actually take some time to come to that decision, and that actually is a moral act, is highly problematic. And I think that certainly ascribing blindly to dictates about acts, this is moral, this isn't moral, I'm going to have an abortion here, I'm not going to have an abortion here, I'm going to do any act and not do it here without thinking about it, is extremely immoral and very problematic.
Excellent. So we've got some really good questions on the table. I'll come back out to you in a minute, but I think it'd be useful if you could get some comments, responses from here.
Well, I think that, for me, the question really is not when does life begin, because I think that we can say that biologically life begins pretty much from the point of conception in some sense. You can describe it in that way. It's all about when life begins to matter. And I think that's a very relative question, and that depends on the way that we perceive what is really going on there and what's really going on with that particular woman. And I think it's one of the reasons why people can work in infertility and can work in abortion, because they can see that the women who want to conceive, that life matters very early on when it's in the petri dish. But for a woman who has an unwanted pregnancy, she's dealing with a very different situation. And I think that that's really why I say that there is a degree of subjectivity in this discussion, not about biological beginnings, but about when it matters and who takes the decision. And I would constantly come back to the point that the person who takes the decision should be the woman, because she lives with it, and not because I think that women always will make good decisions. I think women will make bad decisions. I think that women will make decisions that they will regret. But for heaven's sake, we have to let them do that. You cannot protect people. If they are adults, you cannot stand in their way of decision making. And I think with this, you have someone who's making a decision. You have the woman who's requesting the abortion. You have someone else who's making a decision, and that is the doctor who has been prepared to carry that out. I'm very happy to simply leave those decisions between the two of them without a third party intervening in that. And I think that it is simply a question that you can't be a bit pro-choice or a bit pro-women's autonomy any more than you can be a bit pregnant. We're either basically saying that we're trusting women and doctors to do this, or basically we're not. I think I just want to make one point on the birth points, because I thoroughly accept your point that development continues on after birth, and that from the point of view of the fetus, there is nothing magical about passing through the birth canal that transforms it from a fetus into a person. I think where it's located in that sense, from the fetus's point of view, it simply doesn't make any sense at all. For me, actually, what makes a difference, what I think does make a difference, is the actuality of personhood, which I think is very much, I would define as something having a sense of itself, having a sense of consciousness, having an ability to recognize itself as a being in its own right. But that's completely different from the abortion debate, and why a market has been completely different from the abortion debate, because what is completely different about the moment of birth and the passage through the birth canal in relation to abortion is that there is no longer, after delivery, after birth, that conflict that I'm suggesting is most important to me, which is the undermining of a woman's bodily autonomy, her decision about what happens to her own body. Because once that child is born, how it is dealt with is something that is entirely separate to the question of bodily individual autonomy. And that's why, for me, that is a distinguishing point. It's got nothing to do with the fact that it's suddenly transforming into a morally different kind of being.
Okay, good.
To the two questions about what constitutes personhood and when life begins, it's very, I put this information out so because I hope that we can all discuss this. I think life begins, life doesn't really begin, life is a cycle, it goes on. And even honestly, I've looked at fertilization and that's complicated. There are a lot of dotted lines in the process of fertilization. But, so I'm uncomfortable trying to answer that for you, which does not mean we cannot arrive at an answer. We can discuss that. As to what constitutes personhood, I think basically rational capacity, and so the development of certain abilities in the womb. To me, rational capacity is developing. It's not, you don't throw a switch and all of a sudden an embryo becomes a baby. The alternative to that imaginary view is that these capacities develop gradually over time. To the question of the person who asked about the Gosnell case, who said that it's spurious to introduce that as evidence. I don't think that's fair. Somehow when we get into abortion, and whenever there's something bad that happens, there's a plainly, there's some terrible case that's way later than most people would think is moral, or some doctor practice, we say, well, that's an outlier. I don't understand why we have this exception for abortion. It should be like any other medical issue or any other issue of personal choice, where there is regulation at the extremes. We face those squarely. We don't say that somehow you're attacking the whole concept of the right to choose if you debate whether the extreme should be permitted to go on that way. The question about it's moral to take that the person said it's moral to take your time to think. I agree with that. We need to take some time to think. What I want to suggest to you is that there is a cost, okay? That, by all means, don't run in and, and rush a decision if you just found out you're pregnant. But some of these cases, these women, it's months and months, okay? And there is a cost to waiting, and the cost is what is in that timeline. And so I think that we need to face that. The question of, I've heard from Anne and from someone out here the word mattered, what mattered to the woman, okay? And that what matters is subjective. The woman who wants to have the baby, the embryo in the petri, the IVF embryo that matters already. Not everything in this world is subjective, okay? There are objective facts, and that embryo is not the same thing as a fetus at 20 or 22 or 24 weeks. And that is an objective fact about the rational capacity of the being. And then the last thing I wanted to say was about, you can't be a little bit pro-choice. Yeah, actually you can. You can say, I believe in a right, but the right has limits, okay? And to Anne, I guess I would ask, given this timeline, if everything is arbitrary, is it okay to abort, never mind 24 weeks, is it okay to abort at 28 weeks? Is it okay to abort at 32 weeks? Is it okay, given that we've agreed that there are changes after birth, to kill a neonate, to kill a newborn child on the basis that it is another arbitrary line? Maybe the public has some feelings about it, but objectively, it's hard to draw these lines.
Okay. I'm not going to respond to that just yet. There's the woman in the lanyard there. Yep.
And I was just wondering, are we compromising the rights of the baby for the rights of the woman? because,
Sorry, can you start again?
are we compromising the rights of the baby for the rights of the woman? Because does the government have a responsibility to protect this baby's life? Because once the baby's born, the government will protect it and would not let someone kill it. So why does it change because it's not in the woman's body anymore?
Okay, can you pass it on to the woman with the black top?
Just a few observations. I think that your use of data is really interesting. I'm not denying the facts of the data, I'm denying the interpretation that you draw from it. You said that in your statistics that people are becoming less pro-choice, but they're not actually having fewer abortions. So I think what our data tells us is there's a gap between practice and belief, not that actually things are really changing in terms of women. I think that the gap between that might be to do with things like a compromised view of choice, the idea of safe but rare, the idea of replicating language like calling the anti-abortion movement pro-life, all those things put them in a position where they feel more ambivalent. So yes, they will answer to a poll that they don't like abortion, but actually when it comes to their own life, they may feel very differently about it. I think your use of, viability, the idea that that's some objective thing. Actually, at 24 weeks, if you're born in Malawi, you're probably dead, but if you're born in London, you're probably alive. So, even the idea of viability, those things are not set in stone. I think there's a real problem with the idea that if a woman doesn't have the moral capacity to make a decision about her pregnancy, that somehow she's in a really good position to bring up a child that she doesn't want, probably in extremely difficult circumstances. So I think it's very kind of muddle-headed what's going on around here, and I'm afraid that it's more about making compromises that we think will support early abortion and kind of shut up the anti-abortion movement than it is about a really kind of complex thought process. And the reality is we won't shut them up. The more compromises we make, the stronger they get. And I don't think that any of what you're saying will be anything but a sucker to the anti-abortion movement.
Pass it to the woman right behind you. Oh, didn't you want to speak, the woman right behind you? Okay, the woman in front then.
Thanks. There seems to be two kind of policy discourses going on at the moment. I'd be interested whether it's the same in the States. But on the one hand, a concern about women being pushed into abortion too fast, and on the other hand, a concern about time limits, and the idea that the women are having abortions too late and that the time limit is too late. And I think it's kind of, I think it does sort of indicate some sort of interesting things about the way in which this issue is discussed in policy circles at the moment. I do not believe that women who turn up at an abortion clinic requesting an abortion have been pushed into it too fast. I think they've made the decision and that's why they come. But I do think that there is a sense where, as we know from research, experience, people do often struggle with a decision and take a long time to make up their minds. And it strikes me that the most kind of civilised thing about a country such as Britain that has a 24-week limit rather than, say, a 12-week limit, as in Europe, is that you can say to those women, well, you've got a bit of time. You've got a bit of time to see if your relationship gets back together, to see if you change your view about the, whether to have the baby or to have an abortion, to kind of make that decision. And it strikes me it's a very sensible, civilised and humane thing to do, which is actually more respectful, in a way, of the kind of the idea that you are carrying a potential human life, then it would be to sort of say, well, you've got 12 weeks, make your mind up, or that's it. So I just kind of wondered, how you think this kind of how you think policy makers square this sort of idea of, on one hand, being kind of concerned about women's ambivalence, but on the other hand, pushing the early decision, in a kind of very stark way.
Can we just the woman in the blue there? Yeah. And then I come back to both speakers again.
Little bit of fact I had from Anne Milton, the Minister of Health and an ex-nurse. 1 abortion in 3 in Britain is a repeat. Now, mentions have been here about rights and child. I'd like the right of every child to be and feel wanted and loved by 2 parents. I don't like the idea of off-headed parents, an absent father, or women just going to full terms and just leaving the child for adoption. Sorry, a little bit more rights and to encourage them to go further. No barriers. Abortion if necessary, right to the end.
Thank you. Okay, I'll come up to this side next after the. Do you want to come back first?
Oh, okay. I'll just a couple of things. First, on this question of what of pushing women to go make decisions earlier or take your time. You know, I looked through. I went to the Americans United for Life writes a lot of model legislation in the United States. They're the people who write bills that then get introduced in all the states. So they sort of set the legislative agenda for the pro-life movement there. And if you look, here's what I see on their site: restricting public funding for abortions. You know, we have nothing like the NHS, right? So restricting public funding, restricting funding, eliminating public funding to Planned Parenthood. That, by the way, ends up cutting off contraception services and family planning, as well as abortion. Restricting RU 486, banning insurance coverage of abortions. Informed consent with waiting periods. Parental consent and notification. And clinic regulations. And when they talk about clinic regulations, they're not like reasonable clinic regulations. They're clinic regulations designed to burden and drive the clinic out of business. What do all of these bills have in common? Now, a pro-life person would say, they protect life. No, actually they don't. What they do is they all delay abortions. Every single one of those things delays abortions. So what the pro-life movement is doing is entirely counterproductive to what I'm talking about, which is making a decision as early as you responsibly can. And I understand what you're saying about taking the time to choose, and I do believe that when the woman shows up and asks for the abortion, almost universally, she doesn't need 28 hours. She doesn't need the governor of the state to tell her to take 2 more days. Okay, she's thought about it, and I think honestly, the thing that I most want to concede in this debate is I think that we've done a pretty good job of keeping these numbers low. Okay, this is a relatively rare problem. These women who take too long. By and large, these women do feel the urgency of the situation. They come in and they make the decision, and that's great. They're taking care of it as early as they can. If we could, you know, the advent of RU46 has been terrific. We have abortions taking place within 8 weeks that used to be taking place, if you look at the data, at 9 to 12 weeks. Contraception has been great. So all of this, everything we can do to drive the process backward within what I hope is largely a voluntary framework, except that when we get to the much later weeks, I think is terrific. One other thing, let's see, someone asked about the situation. The way, here is in the UK as opposed to the continent, you've got time to wait for your relationship to get back together. I'm sorry, you don't. You don't know how long that's going to take. And by the way, that brings in male responsibility, something which I hope we'll talk about. Anne's list of these women who came in for abortions, I was pretty upset to see how many of these cases, the guy is leaving in the middle of the pregnancy. I mean, she's going to have the baby, and he leaves, and now she feels like she has to have the abortion. Where are these men in the middle? Why are the men not taking any responsibility? And I should shut up on my end.
Yeah, because you see, the point is that to be a bit vernacular about it, that some people life is shit and then some, and they're making decisions about very real circumstances, not in the abstract, and not something where they're kind of sitting on a panel saying whether they like the feel of something and where it fits in. And the point that I was making is that what is too long for a woman to take to make a decision? I think what the right amount of time is. I know that there are some women for whom things are incredibly clear-cut. There are some women who wrestle with a whole load of ambiguities. The abortion for some women is very clear where they will be with it. For others, it's a really grey area. It's very shaded. They would make a different decision if their circumstances were different. And the point that I'm constantly trying to come back to is who should be in the position to make that decision. One of the most distressing, it was distressing cases that I came across when I visited one of our clinics was a clinic manager who was telling me that a woman who was coming for a reasonably late abortion had asked her to check the lottery numbers from the lottery the night before because she'd forgotten to check whether she'd won the lottery, on the basis that if she'd won the lottery, then she wouldn't need to go through with the abortion procedure. Now that to me is really distressing. But am I in a position to be able to say that's a wrong decision or a right decision? Because clearly for her, she felt that that was entirely a rational way of looking at it. And we can all feel a little bit uncomfortable with it. But you know, that at the end of the day is the future of her life. Just want to say on whether there's anything that I would regard as being too late. I had a really curious experience because when I first started doing some work on this, I had just been delivered of my much wanted baby at 38 weeks. And I was looking at some of the statistics for the post-24-week abortions that have taken place in Britain. And one of them was listed down there as being at 36 weeks, which is 2 weeks prior to the time that I had my child. It really made me think about what the experience of pregnancy is like at that stage, and therefore what the experience of an abortion must be like at that stage, and why somebody must have made that decision. And actually, you know, it really does come down to an issue of trust, because either you think that that woman is the most callous, immoral woman who ever walked on the planet, and so the doctors that assisted her in that woman, or alternatively you draw the conclusion that she had really compelling reasons for making that decision, and that the fetal abnormality was particularly serious. And I don't feel that I want to be in the position where I stand behind that. And I think that people generally do make very considered decisions about this. I was really interested in looking at some historical research that the weird historical accidents, Scotland did not have an upper time limit on abortion as England and Wales did before 1990. The law that set the time limit at what was then 28 weeks in England and Wales didn't apply to Scotland. And there were no more late abortions in Scotland than there were in England and Wales. It wasn't the law that was really regulating it. And I think it's interesting if you look at the situation of the statistics that you've produced about the number of women that actually have late abortions in the US. It's not wildly different from that in the UK, because women do not need the law to tell them, actually. And I don't think that doctors need a legal time limit to regulate their legal behaviour either.
Okay.
Yes?
Can I just pose one more? Coming back to the woman who came into the Gosnell clinic, and let's set aside, I mean, this is irrelevant to what Gosnell was, because she's a woman presenting for an abortion. The DA's report in Philadelphia says she was at 29 weeks. She changed her mind. She actually stopped the procedure. She had what turned out to be a perfectly healthy baby, and that as a healthy child today. At 29 weeks, do you believe that the woman's right to choose, under a woman's right to choose, you would have said, okay, we'll grant that abortion?
What I would say is that what I would like to be able to happen, I'll make the point very clearly that we're only legally able to operate up to 24 weeks. But what I would like actually is for a woman who's presenting at 29 weeks to be treated very much in the same way that a woman is treated at 23 weeks. Because I don't think that those particular 6 weeks make some huge moral value difference to me. And what I find interesting is that, you know, our clinic, I think a lot of the people who work for us will say that one of the most awful and difficult things to do is to tell a woman that she is too late for a procedure to be carried out. And people might like to say something about that. But I think that, you know, that to me seems to be an issue that again is best worked out between the people who are carrying out the abortion and the woman herself, rather than needing the law to intervene. And there will become a point, I would imagine, where doctors say, I am not prepared to carry out the procedure for those reasons. And there are certainly points at which women will say, under these circumstances, I do not want to have the abortion. And what I find most telling about that example is that sorry, I'm in danger of getting very carried away on this point, but I do feel very strongly about it, is that she had appalling care. Because if she's on the table, effectively, and only just being told about what's going to happen, about fetal disposal, and what's going to happen in the process of the abortion, then that is an example of terrible, terrible care. Because basically, what you're telling me is that if she'd known about that at an earlier stage, she would have made her decision in a different framework. So let's just have good quality care, where women and doctors can make the choices that are right for them.
Okay. I've got this group here that have been indicated for quite a while, so can that be go in the back here? Black teacher.
Try and be coherent. This talk about the lateness of abortion, this is it. I mean, like you mentioned the principle, like it shouldn't matter like a minute after conception. And I was just thinking about this whole thing about the callous woman in inverted commas. I mean, say like the week before, an hour before, or a minute before, it's the whole thing about divided by a bit of skin. But it's the whole thing about, I don't know, it's like we also talk about the consciousness of the baby, like memory at 3 years old. But then again, that the baby would develop consciousness in isolation. It's that whole thing about society. And I think people have mentioned about being uneasy about providing abortions and stuff like that, because there is a recognition implicit that this group of cells is potentially a human being, only divided by the birth canal. But would it be relevant to consider also that we talk about the viability of a fetus that's like 24 weeks, but what if the situation was flipped, that actually if a fetus is viable at 24 weeks, what if because the fetus is totally dependent on the woman up until birth, what about the situation if the traumatic experience of being pregnant was if babies were raised in incubators at 24 weeks? Is that a whole different scenario? I do apologise for that. Well, no, I mean, to sort of like give women. I'm sure about it.
Okay. Can you pass to the woman there?
Yeah,
Back to you.
a question to Will again about, exactly when the limit would be that you would set, and to sort of think about what the impact would be on the women that were denied that abortion at that stage in their lives. Decisions that women agonise over for a complex sort of social and medical reasons. And just an example from my own perspective, I work as a genetic counsellor, and the option of termination is really important, obviously, in my field of work. And sometimes it's absolutely necessary as an option at a late stage, because the issue only appears at that stage. It might be on a 20-week scan that certain fetal abnormalities are picked up, and actually even at that 20-week scan it may be unclear what these abnormalities mean. We might need further scans to try to get a diagnosis, to be able to give the couple or the woman any information about what this might mean for the realities of the child that was born, that they would be then caring for. Another example would be with twin pregnancies. Okay, you might have the abnormality in one twin picked up at an early stage, but if you were to terminate that one twin, then the risk of the other twin, that healthy pregnancy, that would end in a miscarriage. So obviously in those circumstances people want the optimum opportunity for that child if they would, and these are decisions that women agonise about. So, it's something that's not treated lightly, whether it's for medical or social reasons.
Thank you. And this woman, two people here.
I wanted to come back to the question of personhood, because I had something happen to me recently that really got me to thinking about it, which is my mother went in for a procedure and something happened during that procedure, and when she came out, her personality completely changed. I mean, it changed in every way. Where she was empathetic, she was suddenly hostile and self-centered. The colors she liked changed. The sort of language that she used changed. And it was this very odd situation where you have someone who looks and sounds exactly like the person you've known your whole life, but who is not, who's like a stranger, who is not the person who you knew. And it struck me that the personhood is, I think personhood has to be much more than just simply a laundry list of developmental milestones, because so much of who we are is about the relationships that we have with other people and the potential of relationships that we have with other people. And you know, just in the case of my mother, she is a stranger, but she has developed different relationships with other people and with me. And so, you know, of course she's a person. And I think that, you know, if you start to kind of take this social aspect into consideration, then I think it is possible to draw a line, because when a person is within another person, the actuality of that situation is that personhood is subjective, because without violating the autonomy of the woman who is carrying that person, there is no potential for anything beyond that. But once a child is born, there is that potential, because there's potential for other people to interact and for that personhood to flourish. So you know, you can have a child who's given up for adoption at birth, and you know, the capacity of people to love that child is tremendous, and the potential is there. It's an actual potential. And I do think we have to draw the line somewhere, and it seems to me that, you know, if we have a richer understanding of personhood, then clearly, and the personhood of the mother too, clearly that line needs to be drawn at birth.
Okay, can you pass it to the man in front?
Thanks. A similar point, really, in many ways. So, Will, you seem to be trying to find a point of principle in biology, and I think you're just going to fail. It doesn't matter how sophisticated the fetus is, it doesn't matter how well it responds to stimuli, how it behaves, it's never going to amount to a person. And the reason for that is that even if it's running around in there and shedding tears of grief and joy, as Stuart Campbell seems to suggest, it's still not enough to make it a person. And the reason being, the womb is just the wrong place to make persons. We don't make persons in wombs. We make persons out here in the world. So I think that you're going to fail to find what it is you're looking for in the womb. And then I think you are becoming hostage to the argument that, well, yes, okay, that's not maybe where we make persons, but stuff that's necessary for persons happens there. And I would agree with that. But now you're at danger of being basically backed into the corner of saying you oppose abortion, because the one thing that's clearly necessary is fertilization. And so I think you're being pushed into that position because it's the logic of the stance that you're taking. I think also you're avoiding an important principle, which is that at every point in the pregnancy, the fetus is physiologically sunk into the woman. It is a part of her. And if women are going to be able to lead lives that are dictated by what they want to do and not dictated by what biology is forcing them to do, then they need access to abortion all the time they're pregnant so that they can lead those lives. That does change at the point of birth. You're right, it's not a biological point of departure, it's not a psychological point of departure, but it is a practical point of departure. Now, the infant is separate from the woman, and society can act on the infant completely independently of the woman. The woman now is free to go off and pursue her own life independently of her physiological dictates, because she's not being dictated to anymore by that particular part of her physiology. So I think you're missing that point of principle. And you've troubled me too. So you chucked in this point about viability, and the public recognises the point of viability as being important. And I think you're right, but that kind of worries me. In this room, I think Will's on the back foot of it. There's quite a lot of people in here who think abortion is late as necessary. out in the real world, I think you'll find that there is a certain sense that there's a point when it's too late. Then you might argue about exactly where it is, but there's a certain sense that it's too late. And that's been informed by developments in science around viability, it's been informed by Stuart Campbell's four-dimensional images, it's been informed by debates about what the fetus can do in the womb, you know. And you open the door a little bit to that being a legitimate approach to the question. So I just wondered if you could comment a bit more on that.
Okay, I will come back to our promise because we've still got plenty of time, so I'll get the panelists to respond to the very myriad of questions that are on the table.
Well, I'm hearing a lot of argument that, to me, leads to the conclusion that abortion should be permitted at least up until birth. I'm really hearing a lot of argument that leads to that conclusion. I don't know how you escape it. Now, if you're willing to embrace that conclusion, I mean, I can't talk you out of it. I think it's crazy, but you can take that view. And I'm not even sure that it would stop at birth, because as the gentleman points out, you know, if you take the principle that nothing in biology can resolve this, you know, birth is actually a biological phenomenon. And if that biological line doesn't matter, you know, the capacities of the fetus, it's just an hour different from what it was before. I'm not quite sure that there's grounds for protecting it at that point. Now, I understand the point about that it is no longer dependent on the woman, but I would point out that if you look at the data on viability, I think it's about 30% chance of survival if you're born at 23 weeks. At 24 weeks, it goes up above 50, and then it goes up to 75 at 25 weeks, and it goes up to into the 90s. So you know, something occurs there, which is that if the fetus were to be born at that point, I mean, it is not dependent anymore. It has the lung capacity to survive. Yeah, you would have to get the woman to deliver it. She is going to have surgery anyway. She's going to have a delivery anyway. I mean, you could have this delivered as a premature infant and it would survive. And so I think we should think about whether at that point, when it would survive if delivered, we have the right to kill it, saying basically, well, it's in my body. It grew in my body. It's still there. So I don't want it. Even though I could give birth to it and it would have a 75% chance of survival or a 90% chance, I don't want it. I don't want to be a mother to this baby. Please get rid of it. And I hope we'll all think about whether that's where we want to go. The other thing that I wanted to bring in here is this whole discussion has been in terms of what should be legal or not, and prohibition. And I want us to think about other things besides the law where we can think about doing things earlier. For example, the woman who brought up genetic counseling. Okay, that's exactly right. You discover something in a scan at a certain number of weeks, and now you have information that once you know it, you think I can't have this baby. What technology has done is in a lot of cases, to make it possible to ascertain these defects earlier. And that's not just true of genetic defects. That I think that in general, any factor that is relevant to a woman's abortion decision should be brought in as early as possible. And that includes the medical system. What Anne said about bad care is exactly right. So we want to bring these women in earlier. We want them to be able to have access earlier, to be able to afford it, and someone to talk to her and explain the situation. A woman shouldn't be coming in at 20 weeks saying, I had no idea that I was pregnant. There's some fact in my life that's going to mean that I now have to have an abortion. A lot of that information was available to her earlier. I mean, make the information available and make the access available earlier. And let's try to move these decisions as early as possible within a framework of choice.
I think that it is completely uncontroversial that we would like to bring these decisions as early as possible. A slogan that we've been using for quite a long time here is to make abortion available as early as possible, but then there's as late as necessary. And I think that this is one of the things that is quite difficult, because it's when we start saying that women shouldn't be presenting at this particular stage with this degree of knowledge, because I think it's very easy for us to sit here and say what women should or shouldn't do. But actually, it's a little bit like saying women shouldn't fall in love with the wrong person, or they shouldn't have sex with the wrong person, or they shouldn't make the wrong decision about a job move or something. There are all kinds of things that we do that are ill-informed. And one of the things that concerns me and about the trajectory of the argument is that, and I think this is behind a lot of the discussion that's been going on in the US, that there is this notion that somehow, if we just organise things differently, the demand for late abortion could be eliminated because late abortion is preventable. And I think that what we've been trying to explain through the work that we've been doing here is that the reasons why women request these procedures late on are incredibly complex and incredibly shaded. And it's not simply a question of providing easier access to procedures or more information that will resolve that problem. There will always be a cohort of women who will come forward in difficult situations, and we have to decide what to do with them. On Stuart's point down at the front, I completely throw my hands up and say that intellectually I do find a cut-off limit of viability very difficult to defend, and I don't think that I would be able to mount a consistent intellectual defence of it. What I would say, and I'd be interested in if you've got any doctors in the audience as well, looking at Patricia, our medical director, what she might want to say about this, is that it seems to me that if I'm going to make a compromise anyway, and if I'm going to accept that on a public policy level, abortion as late as necessary, an extension of the time limit is not going to be winnable. This does seem to be a point at which I can maybe just see something as being slightly qualitatively different. And I think the reason why I'm saying that I would see it as being something slightly different is that if you look at, as Will said, the process of abortion at that very late stage is effectively the induction of labour. And what we're doing in the 22, 23 weeks up to 24 weeks is carrying out a feticidal injection to make sure, to ensure that there is not going to be a live birth at the end of it, because abortion is not about delivering a live baby. Now, I am not sure how doctors would feel about carrying out those procedures at a later stage when statistically there was a higher chance that if the baby were delivered alive, it could then be kept alive and adopted or whatever. But I think it's a fine line, and I have to say I don't quite know what the best arguments are around this. I'd be very interested to know how other people feel about it. I think the point that was made about the fact that viability itself is a very subjective thing between different countries and so on is absolutely right. And I think that where once you get into the viability argument, I can see that you run into real position, you run into difficulties. Is that there is the potential for that time limit to effectively be brought down here, but it does seem to me to be at least some element of political compromise that I can make, even if it's not an intellectual compromise that I would want to make.
Okay. We're rapidly running out of time, and I've run over a little bit, but if you promise to keep your comments to one-liners so that the panel have a chance to kind of sum up, in as much as you can sum up a discussion like this. So there's a woman there with the, yeah.
It's not one line, but it is a very small number of things. First of all, I'd like to say that women's ignorance begins a long time before they're pregnant. And lots of different things come. I meet women who have no idea how they got pregnant, what they would do with the pregnancy. They don't even understand what a pregnancy test is doing or what it's telling them, apart from the fact that they know that they're pregnant. So I think that's a very difficult place to be. It is also very difficult to be a woman who was told all the way along the line that she was within the legal limits, to then come to our clinic and discover that actually she is over that limit. That woman's decision-making process does not change because someone says to her, she is now 26 weeks. Her reasons for not being able to continue that pregnancy have not changed in any way. But her dilemma is she's now forced to continue that pregnancy. And, I think the law, public opinion, does nothing for that woman. Those women are few, and few and far between, but we need to support them, because if she's saying she is not able to continue this pregnancy, she is not able to do that.
Okay, can you pass it to the bloke there?
I think that the foundation of this sort of discussion is a bit of a red herring, actually, and that is the question: when does an abortion become an act of violence against a person, a fetus? And I think we've seen that none of the landmarks of fetal development stand up to scrutiny and can be used to draw a line. And I also think that the answer to that question is not important if we acknowledge that abortion is always kind of like an act of violence against the fetus. The amount of violence involved is more at 7 months than it is at 2 months of pregnancy, but it's always a justifiable act of violence for all of the familiar reasons which we use to defend women's right to have abortion.
Okay. Last word to the woman in the striped shirt.
Just a short point on the point of the wrong decision, because it seems to me we put a lot of energy and emphasis in avoiding wrong decisions rather than supporting what we assume are right decisions. I'm saying this because I come from a country where you can have an abortion only up to 12 weeks, and I know under how much stress this puts women, and actually additionally criminalises women who do need an abortion at a later point. Yes, there are women who are 20 weeks pregnant and didn't know they were pregnant. I came across a woman just very recently. And just last point, Anne mentioned organ donations, and I think it's no coincidence that Germany, which is the country where I come from, is also a country which is very authoritarian at all levels, because a mother who wants to donate a kidney to a child, a very positive act, is also assumed to be taking a wrong decision. She has to see a series of psychologists, she has to go through an ethics committee to be allowed to do this. And I think it's the same, the other coin, the same medal. So, yeah.
Okay. Thank you all very much for your contributions, and I'll ask the panel now to sum up in reverse order.
There's not really a lot more that I want to say than I stand by the position that abortion should be available as late as necessary for exactly the reasons that were described. That a woman who suddenly finds herself in a pregnancy later than she thought she was in, her circumstances don't really change. And I think that, for me, everything comes down to who is in the best position to make the decision about their own life and whether we trust them. And that I think that the last comment kind of shows that there is absolutely no ethical dilemma or ethical situation that an ethics committee cannot make worse or slower. Okay.
I think I lost this debate, and that's okay. I mean, we've had a conversation, and sometimes people disagree. I hope that everyone will leave this room thinking about whether the principle of subjectivity, that the individual should have the right to decide, that only the individual can decide, whether that principle has any limits. Because what I hear is an absolutism about that principle, and a deep anxiety about what happens if we limit that principle. But I think that the slippery slope runs both ways, and we should think very seriously, I hope everyone will think very seriously, about whether if you extend that principle without limits, you're willing to accept the consequences.
Okay, before we thank our audience by clapping, trying to appreciate, I'm not going to do a poll now, because unfortunately, the people who were here to start with and got involved in it actually have to be changed, so Will concedes he's lost the discussion. Can I just invite you to go and have a look at the exhibitions and the foils in the bookshop upstairs, and the ideas market downstairs. And the next session starts here in 15 minutes. But can I thank our panelists for